and the results are, you can see mostly Minnesota, but we don't know how many Montanans are here. So let's get started with our program. I would like to welcome you all to the first ever OLLI Extra. We are glad to have you join us for 6 of the best OLLI programs from South Dakota, North Dakota, Wyoming, Montana, Minnesota, and Iowa. We're working together, a bunch of us OLLI people have been working together to bring you some amazing programs this July. A couple housekeeping notes on this. Please keep your microphones on mute during the session. We did talk to Dr. Mullin. He does have a couple spots where he will ask if there's any questions. We're going to ask you to put those in the chat and we can relay those. We'll do our best to get all of the questions answered, and we respect the time that our instructors are giving us, so we plan on finishing on time. If your questions are not answered during the time of the class, email them to us at the same place that you emailed your request to get the link here, olli@usd.edu, and we will post this and we will get those answered for you. Also, we are going to post a survey in the chat at the end of the program. Please take a minute, we'll stay online, please take a minute and click on that survey before you leave the Zoom meeting. Tell us how we're doing. This is our first one, so we want to know what we can do to make the next one better. And thank you again for joining us, and thanks to all the OLLI people who helped put this together and brought their best of the best to meet you all today. Now, let's meet our speaker. Oh, here's where I have a slight epic fail. It's a slight and epic kind of a, Dr. Mullin, I do not have your bio ready here. Wait, I do have it. I'm so sorry. Okay, Dr. Mullin holds a PhD in American colonial history from the University of California, Santa Barbara. His publications include topics in American Indian, American colonial, and Midwestern history. He is currently a professor of history at Augustana University here in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Dr. Mullin, thank you so much for being here today.
Well, thank you. I'm going to assume that people not in the room can hear me. And if not, there'll be lots of chat. I'd like to begin. The American Historical Association asks that we do an acknowledgement before we begin a class. And so I've taken the one that I use for Augustana. I don't know what USD has. So if USD does not like it, it's the best I can do. I'm sorry. The University of South Dakota, Sioux Falls is located on the ancestral territory of the Oceti-Sakowin, the 7 council fires, an alliance that consisted of the Santee, Yankton, and Yanktonnais. They are commonly known as the Sioux to non-native peoples. The 7 tribes now occupy 9 different reservations in the state of South Dakota. USDSF honors and respects the diverse indigenous peoples connected to this territory on which we gather, and we acknowledge that they were here. And with that, I'd like to begin. I'm a little, at least I'm gonna try it. There we go. It's a little bit different, the title, but I hope it will make sense. Blank spaces and their meaning. What I'm interested in is cartography, and how cartography shapes our understanding of who we are and where we are in the United States today. And we'll get through it. Hopefully there'll be some time for questions. I've said there are some books up here that you can see that have shaped some of this presentation. It is being recorded. I hope to publish some of this down the road. So be respectful, I would ask, of the academic work that I put in to doing this. The live, I want to get rid of this so we can actually see what I've got up there. I want to start with a thank you or two. The first is the South Dakota Osher Lifelong Learning Institute for the invitation. I do not know if I'm the best speaker they had. I was willing to say yes, though, and that accounts for something. So thank you for the invitation. It's my pleasure to participate. A thank you to Thea and Stacy for accommodating a very busy July for me. This is the first of 4 Tuesday presentations I'll give in the state of South Dakota, and this is a fun one to start with. So I want to thank them for working with my schedule. I want to thank Augustana University for the research time and some of the funds that I used to travel to the DRC McNichol Center for the Study of the American Indian. It's changed its name, and we'll see that in just a minute. to the Newberry Library, to the Huntington Library, to the Library of Congress. Without their support, it would be difficult to do this type of work. And a thank you to the D.R.C. McNichol Center for American Indian Indigenous Studies. I received a summer grant and spent some time there working on looking at maps and their relationship to the American Indian. And that was the foundation of this talk. And lastly, to the audience, it's beautiful here in Sioux Falls. I don't know how it is where you are, but when someone asked if I knew what I was competing with, I thought it was the golf course and the swimming pool. And so I thank you for your participation. I want to begin with a question, and that is a pretty simple one. What are some of the terms we hear thrown out about our region? It doesn't matter if we're from Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa. What are some of those terms?
The plains.
The plains, and if the Midwest, and if you do a study as I did, where does the Midwest end and the Great Plains begin? There's no good answer. And if you look at histories of the American West and history of the Great Plains, the issues are the same. And so is it really a distinct region? Is it seed caps versus cowboy hats? You know, these things are what historians quibble about. But there are some terms that are used which we find pejorative, I think, and we chafe against. It's the flyover zone, right? There's nothing here. You know, what could you possibly want to see in the Midwest or the Great Plains? It's the pass-through region of America, right? It's a place to get through. What I want us to recognize is that these ideas are not new. They go back in cartography as early as 1823, and we'll see this map, the Stephen Long map, where he called the Great Plains the Great American Desert and gave the inference that we want to get through it. That is, the plains have always been a place to travel through, not to settle, not to kind of make a living. You could do this talk in a variety of ways, but I want you to think about literature, the region's literature in particular. And I'm just going to throw out a bunch of books, and one will seem weird, but bear with me. I want you to think about My Antonia by Willa Cather. What a great book. Main Street, all right? Giants in the Earth, The Grapes of Wrath. All of these are pre-World War II, I know. So that got me thinking, what's another book that maybe we could use? The Things They Carry by Tim O'Brien, another regional artist. What's important about these books is they convey important messages about the Midwest. In Willa Cather's My Antonia, right? Antonia is the only one who doesn't get ahead. Tiny, Lena, Jim all leave, get rich, find, you know, they don't necessarily get happy, but they leave and they're successful. Antonia is left back in Nebraska, poor, without the modern accoutrements, right? In Main Street, I forget the heroine's name off the top of my head, but she goes back, she's going to this town, she's going to change the town, and the residents of the town, Rock Rapids are kind of crabby. They don't want to be changed. They're provincial. They're everything that the big city hates. Giants in the Earth, Barrett commits suicide. Who would want to live in a sod house, right? You know, get away from here. Grapes of Wrath hold special memories for me because I have families on both sides of the barricades in the San Joaquin Valley. I have one set of family with the guns trying to keep them out. Another set, my great uncle caught the rail here from Mitchell in 1936. So they were on both sides of that. The Things They Carry is really about leaving the Midwest, right? It's about Vietnam, but the men that come back and stay in the Midwest. You can think about being over in Worthington and driving around the lake lost. That is, the literature suggested the Midwest is a place to leave. And the result of this, I would argue, is that we have a hard time defining who we are, what we are, to the larger nation. And that, as I've said, chafes us quite a bit. So as I was preparing this is not the academic side, but I think you'll like some of this. I looked at the 6 states that were participating, and I want us to look at their tourism slogans. And I'm really disappointed Nebraska wasn't here because I think they've got a strange new one. Nebraska, it's not for everyone. Then who's it for? But they get at a point. So I'm doing this alphabetically. This is Iowa. Find your true north. It's time. Be legendary. My great place, which is much better than what we were known for, right? Meth, we're on it shortly before. And then Wyoming, that's Wyoming. If I were to ask you, what do you know about California cows? You'd probably all tell me they're happy, right? There's a very specific call. If you look at the advertisements for coming out there for tourism, it's specific places. What I want to suggest here is that these are blank spaces. That is, there's no connection to them. Find your true north. What does that mean? Unless I know that I'm going to go to the North Woods, okay? Be legendary, great. You know, maybe infamous would be a better word. What's South Dakota's my great place? Okay, my point here is that these slogans do not create a sense of place that is an iconic. It's not like Mount Rushmore, right? Great places, great faces. At least people said, ah, that's Mount Rushmore. There's no place that I can specifically say, ah, that is South Dakota, or, you know, this is Iowa. Okay. What I want to suggest is that these modern blank spaces, this idea that we don't really know who we are, have their origins in earlier developments that are shaped by, and you can see this emergence in the cartography, in the maps concerning the Northern Plains, Central Plains, and the area. And I want to look at those. But before I do, I want to talk about why these blank spaces are so important. The Dakotas, and I don't know as much about Wyoming, Minnesota is very different. The evolution of the Dakotas cartographically are different from most other regions in American history. The Dakotas are mapped north to south, not east to west. If you think about Lewis and Clark, David Thompson, John Mackay, these early explorers, they're using the rivers. And this means that the land itself remains relatively unknown. The Missouri River is the heartbeat of the Dakotas, right? We talk about East River, West River. To people not in the area, they have no idea what that means. Maybe I got too close to that, I don't know.
Sorry about that. No, I got it fixed.
Okay. The other thing that happens is that the Indian polities of the region, and here specifically I mean the Lakota, not Dakota or Nakota people, prevented full-scale mapping of the western portions of the Dakotas until the late 1850s. The Treaty of Fort Laramie of 1851 is an example of Lakota strength and American weakness. That will be changed in 1868, but no one talks about the 1851 treaty, where the United States asked the Lakota to define their territory. And what this means is that the Dakotas are outside the Corps of Army Engineers topographical corps in their mapping. When we think about the maps that took place in West River, and particularly with Harney, he's making that run illegally and quickly because he's afraid he's going to be caught by Lakota warriors. And this means that there are all types of envisioned Dakotas. Lastly, many of the most important maps concerning the Dakota territory are produced when the nation's focus is elsewhere. In particular, the American Civil War, Reconstruction, and then the industrialization of the 1890s. And so our cartographic imprint on the American nation doesn't exist. It just doesn't fit. So what are the results of this? Well, the most obvious result, I would argue, is that the Northern Plains do not have a place in the American consciousness. They're not like California. They're not like Nevada. They're not like the East Coast. They're not even like Florida. I don't like the humidity either, but I do like the beaches. The question was, thank God we're not like Florida, for those who can't hear. But those places have identities. The reason for this, at least in part, is that the Dakotas, and here I'm talking about South Dakota, is settled at the end of Western expansion. We become a state in 1889, okay? The West is already settled. The great Indian Wars are supposedly over. The nation has turned itself in, and if you don't believe me, go get an American textbook, because I can tell you what the chapters are. Chapter 18, Western expansion. Chapter 19, industrialization. Chapter 20, the rise of the city and progressivism. Where do we fit in that narrative? The result is that South Dakota must invent itself. We have to tell our own story. And this is problematic for South Dakota, less so for Minnesota, Wyoming, Iowa. Everyone sees Iowa as Midwestern. But is South Dakota Midwestern or Western? There's a strong debate, strong's not the right word, there's an ongoing debate about where South Dakota fits. I teach at Augustana University. We have a Center for Western Studies. The University of South Dakota has a historian who recreated the Midwestern Historical Association and is trying to make South Dakota a Midwestern state because of its moral values he associates with the Midwest. If you don't have an identity, it's going to be hard to explain that identity to others. And that's an important starting point. So because this is kind of a research project as opposed to just a straight talk, and I'm not sure that's what it's supposed to be, I want you to understand that there is a methodology involved here. It begins with an assumption that maps are both scientific endeavors and political tracks. And for the 17th and 18th century, we might say artistic expressions as well, because they are beautiful. I mean, they're just fun images to have. And my work derives in large part from the writings of a man by the name of J.B. Harley, who died very unexpectedly in 1991. For those in the room, it's the article on the far left from Imago Mundi in 1988, and it's in the bibliography that I've got there. Harley talks about cartographic silences. And a cartographic silence is something that you know should be on a map, but isn't. You know something's there, but it's not noted. And there are whole types of reasons for this. Now, Harley was a European cartographer. He was most interested in England and France. But my work began with George Washington. And for those of you that know, George Washington is sent by Robert Dinwiddie to confront the French in 1754. And in the journal that he writes, he includes a map. And if you look at that map, there are 2 or 3 Indian villages listed: Presque Isle, Queen of Shamokin, and one other. And yet every night he's staying in an Indian village. He's not recording those Indian villages, and the question is why? Well, one could argue it's because he's an 18th century British colonist and he doesn't see the Indians as particularly important. It could be, if I know a little bit more about the story, that the Virginia Company has to settle the Pittsburgh area, and if he puts Indian villages there, the British are going to raise some questions, and that's going to affect his financial future. There are all types of reasons, but that's a cartographic silence. Those omissions matter. Cartographic silences can be intentional or unintentional. I just don't know about something, isn't it? And so I'm not going to put it in there. Or it could be, I don't want to place something somewhere because if it does, it's going to raise all types of political problems for me. Right? If we're going to settle land through vacuum domicilium, that is through the vacant land ideal, I don't want Indians there because it raises questions about, is the land vacant? So these cartographic silence matter. For this talk, what's important is either the omission of the Dakotas, that is, are they on the map? Are they not on the map? Where are they placed on the map? That's what's important. If they're not on the map, I want to ask why. If they're in the wrong spot, I want to ask why. If they're moved around, I'm trying to figure out, are they talking about the Indians? Or are they talking about the territory? And this matters. These kind of omissions matter. The term Dakota is going to move from place to place on these maps. And I'm less interested, and I hope you are as well, in the map's legitimacy. That is, does it get everything right? I'm more interested in what the map says, the message of the map. What are the authors trying to do? All right, and with that, I want to begin looking at maps, but before I do, this is one of those three places I said I'd stop for questions before we get to the heart of the maps. Are there questions either in the chat or in the room that?
In the chat, a couple people mentioned other books that may be Midwest, that may mention the Midwest. Another one would be Old Jewels by Marie Sandoz. And Andrew from the chat said, I would have thought that Ian Fraser's two books, Great Plains and On the Res, would have overcome some of this blankness. Another comment was Minnesotans sort of revel in being flyover country. We like being off the map and off the map of the coastal populations. And one last comment, Linda Hasselstrom's collections of writings by women in the West, like Leaning into the Wind, give a good sense of our area as well.
Yeah, I'm going to get in a lot of trouble for the last one. I find Linda Hasselstrom a whiner. I'm sorry, but I find her writing a woe is me. Look at what I'm facing. But they're absolutely right. As the gentleman or the woman, I think you said it was Chad, that mentioned Ian Fraser. That first book I think is really good. I'm not familiar with On the Res quite as much, but Fraser's done some work that does get at this. But if you were to talk, I have lots of family, East Coast, West Coast. Getting them to come to South Dakota is like asking them to have brain surgery. There's nothing to do here. And while we might like that and revel in that, it doesn't diminish the fact that people are leaving the region. That is, despite South Dakota's growth in population, and don't take this wrong, audience, it's the wrong population growth. It's people retiring home that aren't having children, that aren't sending kids to school, and are here because they get the one-time tax write-off of buying a cheaper home. What we really ought to have are 20 plus early 30s with kids moving not to Sioux Falls, but throughout the region and repopulating these towns, but they're not. And so we face that same. I'm not going to go off grid with Minnesota. It's okay to be quirky. It's okay to be that way. Minnesota, if they're known right, it's the mosquitoes. It's the mosquitoes. So I think those are all good comments. And Linda Hasselstrom, I'm being a little mean to, but man, her first couple books were such a downer. Yeah. And so there's a question here, which I'll repeat.
You said in 1851, the Dakota were asked to define their territory in western South Dakota. What was that territory? Was it the Black Hills territory? How far east or west or north or south did that encompass? And when was it finally named?
Depends who. So the question concerns the Lakota defining their territory in 1851 at the first Treaty of Fort Laramie. So the first thing we recognize, right, is that the treaty takes place in what present-day Wyoming. And it really concerns the Platte River and the Sandhills of Nebraska. The Lakota have moved down, and the Lakota don't want to define their territory. They leave very clearly, say, for right now, these are our boundaries. They're an expansionary power in 1851. They and the Northern Cheyenne don't see this kind of trickle of Americans as threatening yet. Okay, so the Lakota are at this point saying, here's what we currently control. But this does not define us like a reservation or a territory, perhaps as the Ponca or the Iowa might be defined by. Okay, so before we turn to the maps, let's think for a minute about America mid 18th century in 1750. And I'm stealing this shamelessly from Arthur Schlesinger Jr. He wrote a book, America in 1750, but it's a great opening chapter. you could smell the pine from all of the pine trees on the eastern United States 150 miles out to sea as late as 1750. That's how forested the eastern woodlands were. And it was said that a squirrel could start in Albany and end up at the Great Lakes and never touch the ground but from a tree. And so early in the cartographic history of the United States and Canada, there's an assumption that all of North America is forested land. And so what we're going to find are cartographers beginning to identify new regions by the topography, by the lack of trees, by absence. And you see that almost from the beginning. And those that signed up, you got a little blurb, I think Thea sent it out, that listed some of the maps so you can go back and look at these, because I don't know how this is going to look to those looking, via Zoom. But this is Franklin's Carte America, September. It's the first real map that identifies the region we're talking about. All right, you can see the Great Lakes, and there are a couple of people that took an earlier OLLI class from me, right? But all the European, the French explorers were told that Lake Superior is in the shape of a wolf's head. And so you will always see it drawn in the shape of a wolf's head. Now, how they knew that, you'd have to ask a Anishinaabe or a Dakota, but it does. This map is the first to identify the Dakota or Sioux as that country west of Lake Superior. Now, the Anishinaabe, the Ojibwe, as we often call them, and the Dakota, not Lakota necessarily, but there's some Lakota as well, are about to embark on a pretty significant war. Okay, but when the French first to come in the late 17th century, they see this as where the Sioux live. What makes the map important is not just that it's the first to identify the Sioux, it's also the first to see the Great Plains as a distinct geographical entity, as something different. So we're leaving, we're getting to a new area. We're going to move, and we're leaving the forest and we're creating something new. And if this were anthropology, we could talk about cultural area theory, we could do all types of things. But what we're getting then is a more sophisticated understanding that America is not all forest. And it's going to take a different set of settlement patterns, settlement techniques. The focus of Franklin's map is to be scientific, the beginning of the Enlightenment, or part of the Enlightenment if you want to think about it, but it's also an attempt to enforce territorial claims, French claims to the interior. We know that at this time, 1678, that there was a French coureur du bois who had taken his little his wagon, that Red River wagon, and was living on the Big Sioux River up near Flandreau. This at a time when the English were still 50 miles inland. So the French are out there doing all these things. The English are having babies and cutting down forest. In this map, the geography of the plains is in negative. How are you going to make a house if there are no trees? What are you going to burn for fire if there are no trees? The inference of trees also implies that there will be water, right? And one of the characteristics of the West is rivers run dry. We call anything that has water in July and August a river. Everything else is a creek, right? That's one of the definitions of a river. It runs all the time. The Franklin map then is both a warning and an enticement. That is, there's something different out there. We don't know what's out there yet, but it's worth exploring. But be aware. This map right, is a large, that's the title of it. It's a long title. But what's important is you begin to see the rivers, and again, the rivers, because the French are traveling primarily by river. You can go from Montreal to Duluth, basically, and only have to portage less than 100 miles of a canoe. You can canoe the whole thing. And that's very different than if you're trying to come across, say, from Virginia to Ohio, Ohio to Iowa, Iowa to South Dakota. It's going to be a much harder trip. And so the placement of rivers matters. It appears in an English atlas, and what makes it important for us is it reinforces the Great Plains as a distinct entity, as something different from what we're leaving behind. Doesn't make it, from a British perspective, useful, because how am I going to put fences up? If there are no logs to make rail fences, how am I going to keep bison out of my cornfields? And it wouldn't have been corn in the 18th century. They would have done wheat primarily early on. The map omits any reference to the Dakota, whether territory or people, right? So we've gone from present, that first map, to absent. And part of this, one could argue, is a result of the different approaches the French and the English took to Indian relations. Richard White's The Middle Ground is probably the most famous example, but Dan Richter's Facing East would be another example, where they talk about how the French created alliances with native peoples and tried to, because they were small numbers, tried to use Indian custom, whereas the English wanted to control. And so we're less interested in forming those alliances and had more pressing reasons for omitting Indians from the scene. What's important is the map confuses the Missouri and Platte rivers. It also doesn't make sense to have the Mississippi this way, right? So we're still not, and the reason for this is at this time in the early 18th century, the Mississippi River is considered a tributary of the Ohio, not vice versa. And part of this is, right, that was the first river the French came down, and so clearly the Mississippi is flowing into the Ohio, is how I look at it from my placement. And so it's a question of that. But what we have here, right, is a spine, if you want to think about it that way, where we can travel upriver, downriver, and get through. But notice the land has been flattened. The territory is not really of interest to us at this point. There are two other famous maps of the early 18th century, the Delisle maps, 1708, 1718. On this, if you're out via Zoom, the one on the right, the 1718 map, is the most famous map, the most important map. And it's important because for those that took how the American Revolution affected the Sioux Falls, it's because of what's written up here. Nation of the cats destroyed by the Iroquois. And the English claim that is the right then to settle the Ohio Valley. They're going to use the right of conquest, the Iroquois destruction of what were called the neutrals, the Winrows, the cats. And since the Iroquois in 1718 placed themselves theoretically under the British hegemony, the British now can claim the Ohio, and that sets the fight for the 18th century. Here's the Henry Popple map of 1733. And again, at least we've moved the Mississippi River further east, right? We're getting more clarity. It's looking a little bit better. The Mississippi, the Missouri stretching off, it's not in the right spot, but that's less important. The colors mean something. What do the colors mean? And I'm really asking the people in the room since I can't hear the people on Zoom. Who owns what, right? The kind of magenta color, the British, the blue, the French, and the yellow, the Spanish. But they've given the French North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, though the Indians themselves are not yet fully allied with either group. The French are just beginning to set up trading posts. Verendrye has just moved into the area 6 years earlier, and caused them. What's interesting for us is that the Missouri River ends in a lake, right? That lake is going to drain to the Pacific. This is the Northern Passage. This is why Jefferson is sending Lewis and Clark up the Missouri. That becomes the golden tickets. This is the fascination of 18th century Europe. There's no knowledge here of the Missouri's Great Bend, right? That again becomes important with Lewis and Clark. That's their encounter with the Brule. That's where they have that first standoff. But what's interesting is this map ignores the notion of the Great Plains itself. It's suggesting, right, that what's in the interior is the same as on the eastern side. It doesn't really differentiate the Southwest desert as being different. We know today that desert is different than forest. But the purpose of this map was to encourage certain people to go west, to begin trading, to begin challenging French traders, to see what was out there. British officials don't like this. The Board of Trade hates this idea for reasons which we won't go into. But this idea, this map is created to counteract the Delisle map, the French map. All right, that is, the British are now staking claim cartographically to understanding what's there. And if we defeat the French in the 7 Years' War, if we defeat the French in those great wars for empire, that land will be ours. Its accuracy in this case, I would argue, is less important than the message. We need to get out there. We need to settle. If we don't, we're going to be surrounded by the French and will never become what we think we ought to become. By the way, in 1733, there was not a good map of colonial Virginia or of colonial New York. Governors were constantly complaining that there was no map of the colony itself. And there are all types of reasons for this, but we're not going to worry about it. And then there's, perhaps in this region and in southern Canada, the most famous map, the Verendrye map, so 1727 to 43. It's based on an Indian map. He was stationed among the Anishinaabe, just to the north, or to the north of Lake Superior and a little bit to the west. There's a brand new article in the journal Ethnohistory that talks about Verendrye and how an Anishinaabe chief kind of manipulated Verendrye for his own purposes in the war with the Dakota and ended up allying the French with the Anishinaabe. And that means the Dakota are going to have to find new allies. This is going to lead the Dakota to turn to the British in the 18th century for supplies against a better armed Anishinaabe enemy. The focus is from Winnipeg to the Missouri River. This is, if you're North Dakota, right, where Verendrye ends up among the Hidatsa and Mandan. The key here is that we're moving from north to south. That is, we're moving from Lake Nipissing southward. We don't map north to south. This is the only time it really happens. And what he keeps being told is there's a Great Lake. If you go to that Great Lake, right, and it's salty. It's salty. Oh, everyone says it must be the Great Salt Lake. It continues the assertion that we've seen now in two earlier maps, but the third map, that there is some fabled lake that's going to lead to the Pacific. And the map silences the land. And again, if we're thinking about, this is Iowa, or Great Places, or due north, right? If I've silenced the land, I don't know what it is. These are the types of sayings I have to have. Despite his reliance on Anishinaabes, Verendrye really leaves the Dakotas empty. He doesn't place Indian groups. He doesn't place Indian villages. This will come back to haunt him, but we're not going to go into that. And Europe is not particularly interested in this map. is not particularly interested in exploration. And the reason for this is next year in 1744, what happens? The first of the two great wars for empire. King George's War, 1744 to 48, and then the 7 Years' War, which become the United States, is fought 1754 to 1761. And they're not just fought in North America, they're fought in Europe, they're fought in the Pacific, they're fought in the Philippines, so they're fought all over. So there are two responses to Veronese, two British responses. 1757, again, you can see the wolf, and 1775. The start of the 7 Years' War, the eve of the American Revolution. And what's happened here, you can kind of see, right? We've extended Virginia westward. We've extended North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. We're struggling here with this territory because in 1775, that territory had become part of New France, Canada, but it had been assigned to New France and governance there. The map brings, these maps bring the Dakota region directly into European thought and intrigue. We need Indian allies if we're going to fight the French. We need Indian allies if we're going to fight the Americans, if I'm British. What is it going to take for Indians to align with us? It's going to take recognition of our rights. It's going to take trade. It's going to take other items. That is, native peoples are going to participate in these conflicts based upon their own self-interest. There's no intrinsic love affair with one side or the other. What they're interested in laying claims to the territory. Now, Mullin is a cartographer of the French government, and his goal in this map is to establish France's inland empire. The Mitchell map is designed to say, wait a minute, our king gave, if you know anything about the charters, right? If you have grandchildren or children and they watched Pocahontas, you know, Disney is the antichrist of historical accuracy. But those charters said you have territory within these bounds stretching from sea to sea, because they assumed that over just a short distance away would be the Pacific Ocean. So what Mitchell is doing is laying claims that the French had before then. And this brings us really into the Dakotas and probably what you're listening for. This obviously is the most famous of the maps, early 19th century, the Clark map. And I say Clark because he finished it for Lewis. This is the key right here. Let's think for just a minute about the Lewis and Clark expedition. Jefferson, in conversation with Meriwether Lewis, said that he expected, or he thought, that the Corps of Discovery could get through the Rocky Mountains in about half a day. They figured it would take a couple hours to get up the Great Falls. They'd heard of the Great Falls. No one had seen them. No American had seen them, at least, and reported back to Jefferson about them, but a half day. And then once they got over the Great Falls, those Great Falls probably had to be located very close to that lake, which we know exists. And once we find that lake, that river, because we know that the Columbia empties in the Pacific up there, we can probably get boats down it. Why should we care living in South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana about that? Because that's not what happened. And the result of that is that when the gold rush occurs, when the Transcontinental Railroad is built, it's not built through South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana. It goes through Nebraska and Wyoming. And that's because the Great Falls impeded the expansion of industrial America at that time. In this case, the railroad. Right? We know that Bridger's Pass there is that one gap that we can get through, and we can follow the Platte River westward, take Bridger's Gap, and then touch the northern edge of the Great Salt Lake Basin. And then we can divvy up which way we want to go. So these mountains changed the course of Jefferson's vision of the West, of how America is going to develop. And that matters. I mean, I don't see us saying seriously, South Dakota is not for everybody. But Nebraska can play that off, right? A bunch of yokels, right? At least they, last time, I don't think they have the big in for knowledge there on the shirts there, but they can play off. The notion then, what the map suggests is that the Missouri River is not going to be the gateway to the West, is not going to be the avenue of getting west. And that means that we will remain a settlement backwater. Think about how the West is settled. I know I'm starting to think back to that college history course, or right, that football coach who taught you high school history. We get Missouri, then we get Texas, and if I'm from Iowa, Iowa comes in with Texas because of the compromise, right? And then we don't hear anything about the West until the gold rush. And then after the gold rush, everything is backfilled, but it's backfilled in a particular way. It's backfilled to Nevada because of the silver mines. Then it's backfilled to Colorado because of the silver mines, right? Silverton, Durango, that area. And then with the Homestead Act, we begin to settle the central part, and in particular Nebraska, Western Iowa, Minnesota. Then we go north to the Comstock, right, of Montana. Oh yeah, and then we take a detour and head east to South Dakota. It's not until 1876 that there is a bridge across the Missouri River in either Dakotas. And that's the Northern Pacific Railroad at Bismarck, which is the first bridge to cross the Missouri. So when we are a state initially, if I was, say, a representative from Rapid City, I had two choices. I could, take the stagecoach to Fort Pierre, take the boat over, or if I wanted to go by train, I have to go south to Laramie, then go across to Omaha, cross the river, go up to Council Bluffs, cross the river again, and then take the train to Pierre. Lewis and Clark, then, the discovery of what the Northern Rocky Mountains were, alters government perceptions of where we're headed. And you see this with the Corps of Army Engineers. The Northern Plains is drawn as desolate. And again, this is a mistake, because if you read the journals of Lewis and Clark, the Northern Plains are a Garden of Eden. The only time in the Lewis and Clark expedition where they go hungry is when they're in the mountains. The plains are just teeming with life. But they don't show that life because that's not what people want. All right, we'll do this last map, and I'll stop, ask a question, then we'll get to probably what you're familiar with, the 1850s, 60s, and settlement. If the Lewis and Clark map stunted initial development exercises, so did technology. We have to admit that. The Northern Plains, the Southern Plains, the root systems are so tough. We don't have technology, farm technology. We don't have disking equipment yet that will allow us to plow up that deep soil. Okay, so that's going to take, but so did this map. Stephen Long, part of the Corps of Army Engineers, and I say that Robert E. Lee was a member of the Corps of Army Engineers. This is the elite engineering unit of the US government. Okay, Stephen Long, Pike from Pikes Peak, and then I forget the third guy. These are all topographic engineers, and they're out there exploring the 1820s, looking to tell us what there is in these areas, what useful material might be there. Long was originally ordered to go up the Missouri. And his goal was to create a fort at the Yellowstone, Missouri confluence there in North Dakota. The Lakota and Northern Cheyenne said no. They could prevent the US from building a fort. And so Long's got to go elsewhere. And he heads south, and he's going to go up the rivers in Oklahoma, and he stops for the winter in Council Bluffs. Okay. And then he receives new orders, and he heads west towards Colorado. The result of this is he's unable to map, and so we still don't, and you see it here. This is, and I don't, people can, oh, thank you, whoever moving that. These are the Black Hills. We've heard there's a mountain range there, but we don't know how long it is, how big it is, what it's like. And so he just kind of draws in the map. But he is able to head west, as I say. And it's not really fun. It's probably the best word. What makes the map important for us is that Long's map defines the plains, or identifies the plains, as the Great American Desert. Now, when we say desert today, what are we thinking of? Palm Springs. All right. At least I think of Palm Springs. I grew up in Southern California, so that was the desert, right? Hot, dry, not going to grow anything except date palms, and not a lot there. What Long meant was treeless. That's what he meant by desert. It wasn't a reference to lack of water or no water. It was a lack of trees. But the result of calling it the Great American Desert is that in the popular imagination, the plains are now a place to get through, a place to be endured. I mentioned Willa Cather early, and there's a great line in the chapter 1. There was not a road to be seen. This was country of which to build a nation. That's the desert. There's nothing there. You've got, you're going to have to really work hard. Maybe you're going to make it. It's something, and if you think about our stories about the gold rush and the wagon trains and even the Mormon Trail, right? What is the story? Oh, so hard, endured, And if your grandkids played the Oregon Trail with that computer game, and they could shoot all those bison and go hungry, no one stopped to look at the landscape. There's nothing of consequence. It's a place that you can defile, right? I can write my graffiti at Chimney Rock. The Black Hills, as I suggest, are identified, but they're given no shape. There's something there, but we don't know what. And we know that there's gold there as early as 1850. Francis Parkman, in his book, The Oregon Trail, writes about gold being known in the Black Hills, but no one pays attention. Why? Because the book comes out, everyone's headed to California. There's no Dakota. There are no trees, there are no villages listed north of the Platte, right? Again, unpopulated, nothing there. This is a result of the strength of the Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and others. But the result is, in the popular imagination, they're not Ponca, they're not Iowa, they're other. The map then is an implicit acknowledgement of how powerful the Indians are. And that shapes where they're not like the Paiute. And if you're from Nevada, I apologize, but Mark Twain has bad things to write about the Paiute. But the Paiute were different. The Lakota, right, they become the archetype of what an American Indian is, right? Feathered, headband, riding the horse, living in a teepee. These archetypes emerge in part not out of weakness, but out of strength, but they color our understanding of the region as we go through. So let me stop there. And I see Thea's got 1,000 questions, it looks like, at least 17 since we stopped last time. So Talk to me about what I'm gonna get in trouble for now.
Most of it is comments. There really aren't any questions, but there's some interesting ones. Sue says, my husband's family came from the east and were heading for the Oregon Trail, but were stopped in Iowa during the Civil War and decided to stay for the free land given them after serving the Union soldiers, as Union soldiers. Someone else mentioned, Bonnie mentioned Gretel Ehrlich's essays and poetry, Solace of Open Spaces. Let's see, after this is over, I suggest everybody save the chat because there is some really interesting stuff in here. Andrew wrote and got a few comments back that at Portage, Wisconsin, you can get from Montreal to New Orleans with a single 1 mile portage from the Fox River, Green Bay, to the Wisconsin into the Mississippi. The French learned that from the Ho-Chunk. And another comment was the expression my forebears used was, we pulled on through as in adversity. And then we do have a question, hand raised from Marcy Wells. Marcy, would you like to ask that?
I'm curious about what kind of surveying tools they had in these periods, and did the surveying tools improve? Did the technology get better? Did the maps get more accurate?
The maps certainly get more accurate. In the 17th century, Marcy, I'm going to sound like I'm weaseling out of trying to answer your question. I'm not. I'm trying to answer it as quickly as I can. If I'm surveying, say, colonial lands that have been settled by Europeans, I will use a rod and chain as the primary surveying technique. And this requires, if you know Mason and Dixon, that's how they surveyed the boundary between. It's a very tedious, time-consuming, but very accurate. The French explorers in the late 17th century, Hennepin and others, would often ask native peoples how many days it might take to go a distance, and then they would try and measure a day's journey and then kind of compute how much further they should go. So they're not using rod and chain. They might use a sextant. They might use astronomy to kind of do it. But remember, we don't have longitude yet. Let me phrase that. In the 18th century, there's a king's ransom for whoever can discover longitude at sea. And so we can take longitude and we can take latitude, but it's not, there's not a prime meridian. It's probably the best way to put it yet. And so when I do my maps, I've seen maps with Pennsylvania, or with Philadelphia as the prime meridian, Berlin is the prime meridian, Paris is the prime meridian, and London is the prime meridian. So there's some inaccuracy that way. But they're really relying on their experiences and native input for distances. I hope that answers your question. And I'm sorry, I'll do some more digging if it doesn't.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Can we go back to the person from Iowa whose family stayed, who was moving west, but stayed in Iowa and then decided to stay in particular because someone must have been a soldier with the Homestead Act and gotten land after the Civil War.
Yes.
We're not quite at the Civil War yet, but veterans received 1 year reduced stay on a Homestead Act. So if you served 4 years in the Union Army and you took a Homestead Act, you didn't have to stay 5 years. You only had to stay 1 year to prove up the land. That was one of the gifts that was given. The Homestead Act becomes really important. And holy Christmas. How can you help me if I don't tell you who I'm thinking of? Kurt Hackemeyer at the University of South Dakota. He's going to be on South Dakota Public Television on Thursday. Has written a really important article on Civil War trauma and veterans that settled South Dakota. It won all types of awards. And what he found is places like Gettysburg was settled by units were settled by men in units who had seen some of the most fighting in the Civil War. But we don't have the technology to break that soil before the Civil War. That's a byproduct of things that happen afterwards. So that person's family experience in Iowa makes sense, but they couldn't have settled West Iowa. The technology just didn't exist yet to really break that soil.
And I was just wondering, of the veterans that were fighting in the war, some of them were black. Is that not true?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I heard somewhere that blacks were not allowed to homestead in this country, in the Midwest. Is that true, or were there really black homesteaders also? So
I'm going to answer the question, and for those that didn't hear, it was about black homesteaders and were they allowed to homestead. And then I want to get to try and finish our cartographic exploration. There were impediments put on black soldiers, and there were impediments put on ex-slaves called freedmen and freedwomen that settled, but they're often called exodusters. And they primarily settle in Kansas. That's the largest group of black homesteaders. The problem with homesteading is pretty simple. And just in South Dakota, 10% of all homesteaders were women, not men. And 10% of all cowboys were African American. The problem is you have to have resources to get you through those 5 years. And most ex-slaves do not have financial resources to get seed and build, and get kerosene and be able to survive that time. There were laws put in place, but before the Civil War, free blacks were not allowed in Ohio or Indiana unless they showed, I think, $500. There were laws against free blacks entering these states. So the racism did exist, but you could homestead as an African American, but the odds were stacked very heavily against you. Okay, we've got 25 minutes and a few slides to go. This is the problem, Thea, of having an academic do this. Okay, so this is the John C. Fremont. Fremont was another topographical engineer, all right? And he was asked to explore the West, right? Fremont the Explorer. Well, that was his moniker. And this is his map of 1845. His intent is to lay the groundwork. People are moving to Oregon, not California yet. We've just left an economic depression, the Depression of 1837, and people are asking the government to provide protection. And so we're going to go. And so he goes to Laramie, he goes to Bridger's Pass, and he's mapping. What's important for us in this talk is notice everything north of what becomes the Oregon Trail is left blank. It is omitted. We still don't know what the territory looks like. Now, the historical argument for this omission, and Fremont talks about this, is I don't want to draw what I don't know. The scientist in me says I want to leave it blank because I don't want to be wrong. All right. But another reason, perhaps a better reason, others have argued, is that Fremont believes this land is unusable. It's unusable for farming. And that's when people think about the use of land. We're not talking about ranching yet. We're talking about farming. That's the assumption. And the winters are too hard. There's 100-day with agriculture that you need. There are all types of reasons for this. But another reason, this is left blank, is Fremont is told that if he goes and leaves and heads north through Lakota territory, they will kill him. You don't frighten us. We're going to have 20, 30, 40 men. You know, we are in charge here. The result for us is that the Dakotas, also Wyoming to a certain degree, Montana, are emerging outside an understanding of the American West on the peripheries of Western expansion. Now, these four maps aren't going to, I'm just going to go through these really quickly. You can't see anything on them. I know that. So I've blown them up so you can see. So what happens? We have the Fremont map of 1845. And we know that the first settlers are going to arrive in South Dakota in 1858. All right, there's going to be a contested. So in 12 years, people are going to begin to settle at the Big Sioux, at the falls, the falls. These 4 maps are going to place Dakota in different places in their maps. And these are the maps that people are going to use going west. So let's look at them very quickly. This is the Mitchell map of 1846. This blue section here, here's Minnesota. If you can see it on this yellow on your screen is Minnesota. The blue is called Missouri. This is a legacy, I believe, of the old Missouri Territory before Missouri became a state. William Clark was the governor of the Missouri, what became the Louisiana Territory, was named Missouri. I think he just kept it on there. Okay. The red is Indian Territory because we've removed the Creeks, the Cherokee, right, the 5 civilized tribes. We put them in Oklahoma. That's Indian Territory. No one thinks that we're going to settle Oklahoma yet. All right. But what's important here is the Dakota as a term doesn't exist. Neither Indians nor territory. But this is the map most people used when they headed west. Then we get Minnesota. All right. The map of Minnesota Territory in 1851. This red is Dakota. So really it kind of stretches not quite to La Crosse and to the Missouri River. All right. Yellow, Pembina, and the western portion of the Missouri Territory. So Dakota's on the map, but we know it's going to comprise what become 2 separate states. And then we get the map of Minnesota in 1857. And here, the blue portion, right, what we would call in South Dakota and North Dakota, East River, is defined as blue. And everything west is abounding in buffalo. What I want us to see in these 3 maps, right, even if you wanted to think about Dakota, you can't really place it anywhere. And then in 1858, we begin to see development of the Dakotas. But you have no context here. The land has no rivers, no forest, nothing really to make your home, right? We have the James River to a certain degree, not even correctly, but the Coteau is there. But this is not a place you want your future to be. This is not Oregon, the Willamette Valley. The question I have to ask myself, I'm a settler, is Dakota Territory a desert? Then there's this Gouverneur Warren map of 1857. It's published in 1859. What's about to happen? Civil War is about to break out. John Brown is going to lead his raid, right? That is, the nation has a lot of issues besides where is South Dakota, North Dakota, Wyoming located. And this gets to timing. The map is an important acknowledgement that we know very little of the Northern Plains. Right? This remains outside the Corps of Army Engineers' purview. It's meant as a political map. It's trying to unite California, Oregon, with the rest of the nation. In 1857, I might have my date wrong by a year or 2, but not by very much, Abraham Lincoln is visiting Council Bluffs, Iowa, talking to a man by the name of Henry Dodge, if you're from Omaha, Dodge Street. And he's talking to Dodge about a railroad going from Omaha to San Francisco. Is it feasible? What would it take? Dodge will serve in the Union Army. Dodge will be released early before the war's over. And Dodge will, in fact, go to work on that railroad about 2 months, I believe, before the Appomattox surrender. In this map, Warren has said This is Nebraska territory. The Dakotas are now part of the Nebraska territory. Kansas, Nebraska got separated, remember? That created all types of fights. Now Nebraska stretches to the Canadian border. The region is devoid of any geographic features. We don't know what the Black Hills look like still. We don't know any of this stuff. This is a blank space. What we know is that this region has Indians. That's what we know. So here we begin to get what we might recognize as South Dakota, the Northern Plains. We begin to see the settlement of Minnesota, all right? And we begin to see this region of what becomes southeastern South Dakota articulated. Who was one of our first governors? I don't think it was our first governor. I think it was our second governor in South Dakota. Mary Todd's brother. Abraham Lincoln's brother-in-law. His capital was Yankton. Abraham Lincoln has a reason for including South Dakota in a map, right? It keeps the family happy. Everyone can be all right. But what's important here is Dakota's given a particular location. Again, East River. We still don't have a lot of settlement West River in 1864. It's going to begin in the 1870s. That's why Custer is going to explore the Black Hills in 1873. The topography is obscured. The western portion's ignored. It's not yet settled. It's controlled by the Indians. It remains terra incognito. And the Missouri River is, as it has been since the very first map, the influencer of settlement. This is not, you're not settling by wagon train. Yes, you'll come from Yankton or Bonham or some other place, take a wagon to your homestead, but you're taking a boat to Yankton. You're taking a barge, a steamship up the river. You're not traversing the nation. Indians are still omitted. And this bottom one is based on the original Platte drawings of where farming should take place. And what's important here is what does a Platte map do? It conveys organization. It conveys settlement. It suggests progress. It suggests you can make a living here. There's land to be had. And 1864 is 1 year after the Homestead Act. But I can make a Platte map and not show you what the land looks like. The emphasis then of a Platte map is on its orderliness. The idea that settlement is occurring. You want to get in quickly before all that good land is taken up. Let's drive settlement. It's the regularity of the experience. If I have a Platte map and you can homestead it, this makes it just like Iowa. This makes it just like Minnesota. You're not on the frontier. You're not in some godforsaken wilderness living in some sod house. The map also allows you to ignore potential problems, like adequate rainfall. Right? That's the problem West River. John Wesley Powell created a riot in North Dakota at the Constitutional Convention of 1889 because he stood up and he told the delegates, a homestead will not work in North Dakota. You need 3,200 acres of land to make it work. Well, you're not going to get 3,200 acres. You're only getting 160. And the result was, for reasons which we're not going to go into, a riot. And the note taker simply says, a riot ensued, an adjournment was called. And that's all we know. But John Wesley Powell said, West River, you're going to need huge chunks of land. You're going to be different. Warren produces the second map of 1867. And again, the Dakota Territory is made part of Nebraska. Or excuse me, Missouri. And so we're coming off and on. Even if I had family here, where are you living? Combined with Nebraska, you don't stand alone. Western Dakota is devoid of trees, villages, any settlement. Now, there's a reason for this. The Lakota are migratory. They're movement. I don't like migratory. They're moving for particular reasons. Their horse herds need grass. They're not just moving willy-nilly. They're following a particular pattern. They're following bison. But without settlement, vacant land is opened for settlement. And the eastern portion of the area is given a topography similar to Minnesota. Glacial lakes, the Coteau, yeah, it's all the same, all right? But it looks just like Scandinavia. So OLLI Rolvog can come and do his thing. My point here is these maps, in addition to creating blank spaces, have not left the public with any real sense of where we are. Nothing to really say that's where the Dakotas are located. And so here, the last map before we get to settlements, and Thea, I will make it in time, I promise. This last map. The Dakotas are now a unique entity. To me, it looks an awful lot like Montana, just to the east. Okay, it's combined East River, West River. There's a sense that they're all the same, but we begin to see, right, the rivers actually filtering in, being placed on the map. The Missouri River, which has been so important for all these earlier maps, is not given a central place in this map. It's just one of many rivers. I need rivers, why? To farm. The Missouri is not given, and that's because we begin to see people in the 1860s, 1870s, settling southern South Dakota and spreading upwards towards Brookings and elsewhere. But there's another reason. Those early settlers, they want railroads. And by minimizing the breadth of the Missouri River, by minimizing the number of rivers, the number of bridges you're going to build, I can maybe convince some railroad company to build a spur. And if you know anything about the history of Sioux Falls, and those on the call, I don't expect you to know anything about the history of Sioux Falls, but our first senator, R.F. Pettigrew, spent all of his time trying to bring railroads in, negotiating railroad contracts, trying to get a connection to Yankton, right? Because railroads defined progress. Railroads were the future, kind of like an Amazon distribution center defines progress going forward. There's only one path identified into the region, kind of comes up this way. You can't really see it in here, but again, it's East River, and there's very little settlement on the Plains West River. There's a lot of settlement Black Hills, not a lot of settlement between Fort Pierre and Rapid, or Bismarck and the Badlands. In fact, at that North Dakota Constitution Convention, there were only 4 delegates in North Dakota that lived West River, North Dakota, and 3 of them lived in Mandan. South Dakota was a little bit different. Our West River delegations all came from the Black Hills, from the mining industries, the Homestake Mine and others, West River. So we were represented West River by the mining companies. So here is, and I hope you can see it, this territorial map of 1870. What's important for us, and I'm just going to kind of race through this one so we can get to the next 2, is we've laid out a proposed railroad track. It tells someone we have railroad connections. We are not the frontier. You can get from point A to point B. You can get your crop to market. You can make a living here. And you know that if there's one railroad that's here, more are coming. So this railroad matters because it gives a sense of progress. You can now come and settle. This will help us with statehood. This will do all types of things. All right. I don't like, sorry. I told Thea we would get through this on time, and we are going to get through it on time. So the map, what I didn't show you, had a series of railroads connecting parts of South Dakota. Okay, 1893, is a depression. We become a state in 1889, but we need to draw people in. We had the bonanza farms in the bonanza years, the 1870s, 1880s, grasshoppers had kind of killed off. But in 1895, this Rand McNally map appears, this atlas. And what makes it important is everything is settled. All of the counties are organized. Now, if you have done reading in Western South Dakota history, Paul N. Nelson has written a series of books on settling West River. West River is not settled until after 1900. Its primary filling in is 1905 to 1917. Okay, so this portion really isn't as settled as we might like it. But the point of the map is trying to make is that South Dakota is settled. South Dakota can be settled. It's just like the rest of the nation. But what haven't I shown you in any of the maps yet? What the land looks like, what the topography looks like. I've created a state, but not an idea of what that state looks like. It's settled. All portions have been organized. And if you have free time, you can figure out which counties got combined later and change their name, but that's not really important. The differences between East River, West River are ignored. And for those that are not from South Dakota or North Dakota, West River tends to be drier. We're getting close to the 100th meridian. West River tends to rely far more on grazing than in farming. East River, you can still primarily grow corn. You can grow wheat, soybeans without relying on irrigation. West River is going to rely on irrigation. So there are some subtle and important differences in East River, West River that I can cover up. And it's going to take a generation or two to learn those West River techniques. The goal with Rand McNally is simple: sell land, right? How did we get those railroads? By giving them sections of land that they could sell. Here's where you are, come and settle it, we can get it. The map doesn't give a context for where we're located. This could be Kansas, right? It could be Wyoming, could be Iowa. Unless you know the states above, below, to the side, it could be anywhere. The problem for South Dakotans trying to lure people in is that the nation is preoccupied with industrialization. We've just had a major industrial depression. It was caused by the railroad collapse. It produced mining or problems with the silver industry, but industrialization or preoccupation, industrialization particularly drawing workers, immigrant workers into eastern cities, and that becomes the preoccupation. And if you think 1895 is the beginning of the progressive period, and Wisconsin will lead with La Follette and others will lead the progressive period. And South Dakota is part of that as well. Statehood here has been achieved, right? Statehood is more political than geographic. What I mean by that is we're equal. That was the goal. We wanted representation, but we still haven't defined ourselves to the rest of the nation. We are a state, but we came in with North Dakota. What separates North Dakota, South Dakota? Depends if you live in North Dakota or South Dakota, say some things. So what do we do with all of this? Or what do I want to do with all of this? What do I want you to take from it? The Dakotas are an afterthought to cartographers. They don't, and we continue, as those tourism euphemisms suggest, we continue to struggle with that. What are we? Right? Should we be North Florida? That'll draw those people in. But that has implications. The maps constantly moved or omitted the region. They created these cartographic silences, and these cartographic silences mean that there's nowhere in our kind of collective memory that places South Dakota. I mean, if I were to ask about Oklahoma, what would you say the one thing you knew about Oklahoma? The Sooner Rush, right? The one where everyone gets their land. Okay, we're gonna watch all the cowboys. I mean, what was South Dakota's? California, the gold rush. For Oregon, perhaps it's the missionaries. For Minnesota, what is it? Probably the Dakota conflict of 1862. That is, there's something you can say that happened. Perhaps for South Dakota, it's either Wounded Knee 1 or Wounded Knee 2. But nothing like the Sooner boom, nothing like these others. And the reasons that this region is omitted are multifaceted. It's not the man trying to keep South Dakota down and saying, you know, you're not important. It's timing. It's timing. But the result of all of this is that this region, the Northern Plains in particular, that's how we started, right? What is this area called? A flyover zone, a drive-through zone, you know, the forgotten zone, the flatland. There's a great biography, Living Vertical in a Horizontal World. She grew up in North Dakota, but that kind of notion, right? The reasons are multifaceted, but unless we kind of determine what our story is, we're constantly going to battle a lack of knowledge. The result of all of this is the Dakotas did not enter the American consciousness as other regions did as a result of particular events. And the result is we're still trying to figure out what we are and where we fit in the American story. And that's good for me because it means that historians have jobs. But I think it's worth considering how these early maps, these early omissions continue to shape the world we live in. So I thank you for your listening. I hope that this was what the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute wanted. If it's not, you can just say we had Mullin and don't do this. But that's all I've got for right now. So thank you for listening, and I will check the chat. Thea, were there questions or comments that I need to be aware of?
Yeah, there's a couple interesting questions. Rick said, this makes me wonder even more why the Dakotas weren't divided into East and West Dakota rather than North and South.
Before you give me the next question, the quick, short, dirty, quasi-correct answer is that Dakota statehood began by the mining companies wanting to become state, and they wanted the state of Abraham or the state of Lincoln. And what Dakota politicians, in particular those in Yankton, were afraid that if they got statehood West River, that they'd remain a territory. And so East River politicians jumped on that bagwagon and tried to usurp West River's, in this case, Black Hills' desire for statehood and combine it into a single state. And that led then, are we going to have two states or one? And the fight over the Dakota, the capital of Dakota Territory, when it moved from Yankton to Bismarck. So that's why it's combined and we don't have an East-West. The state of Abraham or the state of Lincoln, I forget what they wanted to call it, was the cause of that. I believe they asked for statehood as early as 1878 or 1882.
That's great. Liz from Augustana also said there's a new article from Cowboys and Indians magazine on that very topic, and she put a link in the chat. If anyone wants to grab that, it would be a good time to copy paste that.
That's what a good archivist can do. Liz is
I know, she's
at the
great.
Center for Western Studies and is one of the archivists. She knows a lot of things, so she's on top of it. Thank you, Liz.
Absolutely. She also asked, what's the planned outcome for this research project?
I love my maps, as you can tell. I'm trying to write a history of Sioux Falls. That has to take top priority. And I'm close. I think I have 2, maybe 3 chapters left on that. I think this could be at least an article. I don't think it could be a full-length book, but I'd like to see it, an article maybe in Great Plains History or one of the state journals. But I'd like to move from a presentation to a formal written article. That's the plan.
I've also got Marcy with your hand raised. Marcy, would you like to ask your question?
You know, when this couple, the Poppers, wanted to make the plains the Buffalo Commons, are these maps related in any way and to influence them, or did they think it as just a desert? Or
so Marcy, I hope you don't mind if I call you by first name. I'm so happy that you mentioned the Poppers, because when I first started this, I was in contact with both Henry and his wife, Catherine, who wrote the Buffalo Commons. And in the introduction, going back to Liz's question, I mentioned a book by Anne Matthews. I think the book's name is called Where the Buffalo Roam. And she has a table of contents of where the Great Plains are. And she omits South Dakota from the Great Plains. And it catches my attention because she's from South Dakota. And the book is about a year she spent with the Paupers talking about the Buffalo Commons. And it's an interesting, but that's the type of omission. I think the Paupers, you know, for as controversial as they were, many of the things that they talked about have come to pass. And we're going to have serious conversations in this state and elsewhere about what does infrastructure look like down the road in say, Ziebach County or Perkins County. The research I did for an earlier project, Perkins County had 13 kindergartners for the whole county. That county is larger than Rhode Island. How do you maintain a school system? The 6 West River counties in the northwestern corner, 47% of all the houses in that district are vacant. Those 6 counties. That's usually a person's most important economic investment, the house. Now in West Road, it's going to be land. But we're confronting what the Paupers suggested. I think their article came out in the late 1980s. And Henry has been great. They're both retired from Rutgers. Are you all in this room? Are you all familiar with the Buffalo Commons theory? And I'm going to guess others. The Buffalo Commons said that people are leaving. What we ought to do is convert all of this land and reconvert it from farmland back to pristine wildlife. And we can create ecotourism. We can do these things and just have people not live where they currently live. The problem, among many, is that I can get insurance for crops. I can't get insurance for animals. And so there's a drive, if I'm a West River rancher farmer, to convert to farming as opposed to ranching, because there's a safety net that exists for farming, but not. But that was his argument. And there are all types of studies done oftentimes in Kansas looking at that future. There's a question here. Do we have time to answer it, Thea, or am I?
We want to respect everybody's time. You are welcome to answer it if you have time. Anybody who needs to leave, feel free to, but I would ask that you grab the link to the survey that's on the chat right now. We'd love to get your opinion. And I will print out the chat and I will be sending out an extra email to everyone with some of the links provided. But I'm going to leave this link live for a few minutes, so feel free to answer that question if you want.
All right, so I have a few minutes, yeah.
The Missouri River is
Yes.
longer from where it goes into the Mississippi than the Mississippi is. Is it partly because of this whole thing that it's not the Missouri River all the way down to the, what reason is there for it?
What reason is there? So the question concerns the length of the Missouri River versus the length of the Mississippi River, with the Missouri River being longer.
And so why isn't it Missouri all the way to the Gulf?
And the reason, the quick answer is the reason it's not called the Missouri River once they all conjoin is that the Europeans coming from the east ran across the Mississippi first. And that's why they originally called it the Bell River. The Ohio River was the beautiful river, then the Mississippi River, and then the Missouri. But the Mississippi became the primary vehicle because of European and really American and their perspective. They were looking west as opposed to east.
Yeah, even though the Missouri
Yep.
is much longer.
Yep. But again, the Mississippi was mapped before the Missouri was as well. All right, well, I think that's all the questions here. I want, again, Thea, thank you very much for the opportunity, and for those that listen, I look forward to the future talks in the OLLI Extra experiment.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us. I am so glad to have you here. We'll see some of you tomorrow for our next OLLI Extra, and the rest of the month we have quite a few great ones planned for you. Everybody grab those links, grab that SurveyMonkey link that you see there and take that survey for us. I'll stay on for just a couple more, maybe another minute or so you can grab that link and we'll be good.
All right, so let's just see.